At its peak, it's estimated that around a third of the world was under communist rule. Communism spread from Soviet Union to China, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Communist leaders such as Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Fidel Castro were among the most influential people of the 20th century. The continual rise and spread of communism after World War II led to the decades-long Cold War between the communist states and the West. It resulted in major conflicts in countries such as Vietnam and Korea and the frighteningly tense Cuban Missile Crisis. However, communism wasn't a suitable model, and it eventually fell on its own sword. When the Berlin Wall came crashing down in 1989, it spelled the end of the political system that had threatened but ultimately failed to win the battle against capitalism. Today, communism remains in just 5 countries: China, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea. While the extent of communism and socialism varies, these 5 countries are the legacy of what was once a serious global force. How then did communism spread, and why was it more prevalent in some regions than others? The seeds of communism were sown in 1848 in Germany with the publishing of the Communist Manifesto. It was the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who were German academics and philosophers. The pair had visited England, and they were concerned with what they saw as an unequal distribution of wealth under the capitalist system. Marx was particularly unimpressed with what the Industrial Revolution had brought to the world. What some saw as a giant leap forward, Marx saw as the wretched repression of the working classes. The pair decided that a new system of government was what was needed, one that would see the shares of labor distributed evenly throughout society. This new system would be communism, and its key points were outlined in the Communist Manifesto. Marx and Engels called for the working classes to rise up against capitalism with the fiery motto, "Workers of the world, unite." This was to have an enormous influence on much of the world, beginning in the early 20th century in Russia. Vladimir Lenin was a Russian Marxist and a revolutionary activist. He had been profoundly influenced by Marx's writings, such as the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. Like Marx, he was also tremendously disillusioned with the global capitalist system. He saw it as a sure way to guarantee endless war, inequality, and hardship, and he began to drum up support for his communist revolution. Lenin realized that many Russians were physically and mentally exhausted from the tolls of World War I, which had caused huge losses of Russian lives and severe food shortages. He envisioned a revolution that would engage the Russian urban and peasant workers alike in what he called a dictatorship of the proletariat. In 1917, Lenin published a book that outlined his idea and why he was so vehemently opposed to capitalism. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin argued that the imperialist and profit-seeking nature of governments meant that the world would always be at war. Lenin began to gain a mass of supporters, and by 1917, he had an army that was ready to fight for the communist cause and replace the rule of the Tsar. Lenin formed Russia, and the world's first communist party, which paved the way for the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The revolution saw the overthrow of the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, which resulted in a new communist government led by Lenin himself. Russia had become the world's first communist country. By promising to redistribute land and wealth equally, Lenin managed to gain support of Russia's huge rural peasant class, as well as the industrial workforce. He was also able to convince non-Russians to his cause, and in 1922, the Soviet Union was formed. Initially comprised of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Lenin's October Revolution inspired young revolutionaries in China to form their own communist party. By the early 20th century, many Chinese had also lost faith in their leaders. Corruption, economic mismanagement, and a slide in regional power had disenfranchised much of the population. The numerically superior China had offered a humiliating defeat to Japan in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1895. Japan's victory highlighted China's inability to modernize and adapt to a changing world. Added to this was the mass rural exploitation throughout the country. Wealthy landlords controlled most of the farming land in China, and more than half of the rural peasants owned no land, or very little. The peasants were taxed and exploited, and famine was common. China's young urban intellectuals were starting to take a keen interest in the rise of communism in the Soviet Union. They had read translations of Marx's works and Lenin's books on imperialism. The Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 allocated the German-controlled territory of Shandong to Japan, instead of handing it back to China. This enraged many Chinese, who were already fed up with their government's ineptitude. It had lit the fuse for a nationwide series of protests, otherwise known as the May 4th movement. The protests were significant because they didn't just include the urban intellectuals. Massive numbers of working-class protesters also took part in protests against the system of imperialism and feudalism that many Chinese felt had let them down. Swept up in the emotion and passion of the May 4th movement was a young man named Mao Zedong, who would go on to take communism in China to unprecedented levels. The Chinese Communist Party was established in 1921 in Shanghai, including Mao as one of its founding members. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Lenin's poor health led to the rise of Joseph Stalin. In 1922, Stalin replaced Lenin as the leader of the Soviet Union. He had long been a right-hand man of Lenin's, despite their differences regarding the best systems of rule. In China, the Communist Party sided with the Nationalist Party in a bid to purge China of its northern warlords, who stood in the way of China forming a centralized government. Although successful, in 1927, the Nationalist Party then turned on the Communists, forcing Mao and his followers to take refuge in the southeast provinces. It was during this time that Mao realized the enormous potential of garnering support from China's rural peasantry. Just as Lenin had done in Russia, Mao won the peasants over by pledging to redistribute land and address social inequalities. He relocated his army to China's northwestern regions, and at the end of World War II, Mao had amassed an army of close to 2 million soldiers. Civil war broke out in China, and this time the communists were victorious. In 1949, Mao proclaimed himself as the leader of the People's Republic of China. Like Stalin, it was the beginning of a lengthy and controversial reign that featured incredible achievements and disastrous policies. Both men stuck to their communist principles of forming centralized governments, and both embarked on the industrialization of their countries. However, mass executions, starvation, and persecution also marred their time in power, which posed serious questions towards the validity of communism. The end of World War II saw communism spread far beyond the Soviet Union and China. A sizable chunk of Eastern Europe fell under communist Soviet rule, including East Germany, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Balkans, and Albania. In 1945, the US and the Soviets took control of Korea, which had been previously invaded by Japan. America and the USSR agreed to split Korea in half, with the US controlling the south and Moscow the north. In 1948, the North officially became the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was the latest communist state, and its leader Kim Il-sung had been groomed by the Soviets. Tensions in Korea inevitably led to the Korean War, with the USSR and China lending support to the Communist North. Communism had also spread to Vietnam before World War II. Ho Chi Minh had spent time in London during the First World War and was introduced to Marxism and the Russian Revolution. He returned to Vietnam, and in 1930 he formed the Communist Party of Vietnam. Just as with Lenin and Mao, Ho Chi Minh was driven to restructure Vietnamese society from French rule to redistribute land and wealth amongst the peasant classes. In 1945, he became the president of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and eventually saw off French colonial rule. As with Korea, Vietnam was also dragged into war, with the Soviet and Chinese backed North Vietnam up against American forces in the south. The Communist North gained control of the country in 1975, and Vietnam has since remained a communist state. The spread of communism wasn't restricted to Asia. Thousands of miles away, much of Latin America also fell under its spell. The exit of Spanish rule had left many economies reeling with inequality and ruled by elites. After World War II, many European intellectuals and Marxists emigrated to Latin America, bringing their communist ideologies with them. One of the more noteworthy advocates of the move toward communism was a young Cuban political activist. Fidel Castro became heavily involved in revolutionary movements aimed at disposing the American-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's motives were very much communist-based, just as it had been with Lenin and Mao. It was all about giving workers control of the means of production, and very much against imperialism in all its forms. In 1959, Castro led his guerrilla army to a successful revolution, and Batista was forced to flee. Castro remained in charge of the Cuban Communist Government until his death in 2016, and the country remains a Marxist-Leninist republic. Other countries, such as Nicaragua, Yemen, Somalia, and Mozambique, have all experienced periods of communist rule at some stage in the 20th century. The spread of communism was characterized by a common ideology that struck a chord worldwide. The basic principle of reclaiming the means of production for the workers and the equal distribution of wealth and land was the driving force behind the rise of communist governments. Ultimately, though, the inefficient, centralized planning weighed it down, as did a lack of innovation, which was typically driven by profit incentives. Communism simply ran out of steam.